In 2026, the United States marks 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It is a moment not only for celebration but for reflection on how a collection of Atlantic colonies became a continental nation, and how ideas born in 1776 continue to reshape land, law, and lived experience far beyond the original 13 states. 2.5 centuries of revolution, conflict, expansion, innovation, struggle, and reinvention. To understand that story, it helps to look west, into the mountains and river valleys of what is now Wyoming, where the national story of independence, expansion, and identity met landscapes that were already deeply known and meaningfully inhabited long before the United States existed. This is the story of Fremont County and the broader Rocky Mountain West during the foundational era of the American Republic, roughly 1776 through the aftermath of the War of 1812. It is a story of indigenous nations whose homelands structured every pathway through the region, of Revolutionary-era ideals slowly reaching the interior West, and of early explorers, military officers, and entrepreneurs whose ambitions helped to find a new continental nation. It is also a story of geography, of passes, rivers, and mountain corridors like Union Pass, which quietly shaped the direction of American history. When the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia in 1776, the United States was a fragile experiment hugging the Atlantic seaboard. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay vast territories that most Americans knew only through rumor, trade accounts, and indigenous diplomacy. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode, we wrapped up Season 2 with a look at tourism on the Wind River Reservation. We investigated the costs, benefits, and unique challenges of tourism on tribal lands. We explored the crucial role of Indigenous-led tourism and looked at initiatives on the reservation, including ecotourism, driving tours, and more. This episode marks the beginning of our 3rd season and is a special episode focusing on the United States' 250th anniversary. Far to the west, in what is now Wyoming, the land was not empty. It was part of a complex indigenous world connected by trade routes older than any European map of North America. The Eastern Shoshone, Crow, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Lakota, and Ute moved through these landscapes seasonally, following game, trade networks, and ceremonial cycles. The Tekulega, sheep-eater Shoshone, lived in the high country of the Wind River Range and Absarokas, developing specialized knowledge of mountain ecology unmatched anywhere in North America. These were not isolated groups. They were connected by an intricate system of trails that cross rivers, mountain divides, and basins. Long before American independence, these routes carried obsidian, buffalo robes, medicinal plants, mountain sheep horn bows, and horses. They also carried stories, alliances, and diplomatic relationships. When Americans declared independence, they were entering a continent already structured by thousands of years of human movement and meaning. During the Revolutionary War, 1775 through 1783, most fighting occurred in the east, yet its consequences would eventually reach the Rocky Mountains. The war created a new political identity, citizens of the United States rather than subjects of the British Crown. It also unleashed competing visions of expansion. Many leaders believed the new nation would eventually stretch across the continent, though few understood what lay beyond the Mississippi River. At the same time, indigenous nations of the West observed the conflict with strategic awareness. British, Spanish, and American interests all competed for alliances and trade relationships. The Rocky Mountain region was not peripheral, it was part of a larger continental system of power. By the war's end in 1783, the Treaty of Paris granted the United States claim to lands extending to the Mississippi River, but claim on paper did not equal control on the ground. The interior West remained indigenous territory, shaped by its own political and ecological systems. Still, the idea of a transcontinental nation had been born. In the decades after independence, the United States struggled to define its identity. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, the federal government was established, and under leaders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, attention increasingly turned westward. Jefferson, in particular, envisioned a republic that would expand across North America through exploration, trade, and settlement. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the nation and opened vast unknown territories to American inquiry. But unknown is a misleading word. Indigenous nations knew the land intimately. What changed was that Americans began attempting to map, document, and integrate it into their political imagination. This is where the Rocky Mountains, and eventually Fremont County, enter the national story. The Rocky Mountains were not a single barrier, but a series of corridors and thresholds. Among the most important was Union Pass, a high mountain route in northwestern Wyoming that connects the Wind River, Green River, and Yellowstone River systems. For Indigenous travelers, Union Pass was a critical crossroads. It allowed movement between the Great Plains and the interior basin country, facilitating trade, hunting, and seasonal migration. For early American explorers, it would later represent something even more significant, proof that the Rockies could be crossed. Though Union Pass would become better documented in the 19th century, its importance reflects a deeper truth about the West during the Revolutionary and early Republic era. Geography did not block movement, it organized it. Every river valley and mountain corridor functioned as part of a continental network already in motion. The War of 1812 marks a turning point in this story. While the conflict is often remembered for battles along the Atlantic coast and the burning of Washington, D.C., it had profound consequences for the interior West. By this time, veterans of the American Revolution were aging or deceased. The generation that would shape the Rocky Mountain fur trade instead came from a newer conflict, the War of 1812. These men carried a different experience of the Republic, one forged in a young nation still defending its sovereignty. They would become the entrepreneurs, soldiers, and explorers who pushed into the interior West in the decades that followed. The war also weakened British influence in parts of the northern frontier, opening space for American commercial expansion through companies, military expeditions, and private ventures. In the years immediately following 1812, American interest in the Rocky Mountains intensified. The primary driver was the global demand for beaver felt hats, which made the interior West economically significant almost overnight. The earliest fur trade expeditions did not seek settlement. They sought knowledge and profit. Trappers, traders, and military-adjacent entrepreneurs entered the mountains to map resources, establish relationships, and identify routes. Among the earliest major figures was Major Andrew Henry, a veteran of the War of 1812 and co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Henry led early trapping expeditions into the upper Missouri and Yellowstone regions as early as 1810, later pushing south into Wyoming's river systems. His work helped establish the commercial logic of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Another key figure was Major William Henry Ashley, a Missouri militia officer and entrepreneur who never served in the Revolutionary War, but embodied its expanding legacy. Ashley pioneered the rendezvous system, a revolutionary trading model in which trappers and suppliers met annually in the mountains rather than relying on fixed trading posts. The first major rendezvous in the Rocky Mountain region is associated with gatherings near present-day Wyoming in the 1820s, including areas around McKinnon. Ashley's system transformed the West into a mobile economy. Among Ashley's partners was David Edward Jackson, a fur trader whose legacy is embedded in the geography of the region. Jackson, associated with Jedediah Smith and William Sublette, became part of the group that bought out Ashley's enterprise, forming one of the most influential early fur companies in the West. Jackson is the namesake of Jackson Hole. His father and uncle reportedly served in the Virginia militia during the war. Though Jackson himself was not a Revolutionary War veteran, he belonged to what historians often describe as the sons of the American Revolution, men shaped by its aftermath rather than its battles. This distinction matters. By the time these men entered the Rockies, the Revolution had become memory, myth, and political foundation rather than lived experience. The fur trade era produced a new kind of American figure, the explorer-trapper. Men like Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, Thomas Fitzpatrick, and William Sublette were not simply adventurers. They were geographic innovators. They mapped river systems, learned mountain passes from indigenous guides, and established routes that would later become migration corridors. Smith, in particular, crossed deserts, mountains, and basins that few Americans had ever seen. His journeys helped connect the Great Basin, the Rockies, and the Pacific Coast in the American imagination. But their knowledge was never created in isolation. Indigenous guides and traders provided essential information about terrain, weather, resources, and survival strategies. The expansion of the United States westward was a shared, and often contested, process of knowledge exchange. By the 1820s, the Rocky Mountain West had become a dynamic commercial frontier. The fur trade brought together indigenous nations, American traders, and international markets in a seasonal rhythm. By the time the Rocky Mountain fur trade peaked in the 1820s and 1830s, veterans of the American Revolution were aging or deceased. Instead, the veterans directly involved in Wyoming's fur trade were men who fought in the War of 1812, while the prominent mountain men of the West were the sons of the American Revolution, rather than veterans themselves. One of the most important leaders of this era was Captain Benjamin Bonneville. Born in France and serving as a U.S. Army officer, Bonneville took official leave in 1832 to lead a fur trapping and trading expedition into the Rocky Mountains. His expedition represented both private enterprise and semi-official reconnaissance for the U.S. government. Bonneville's journey included one of the first documented wagon crossings of South Pass, a critical corridor that would later define overland migration routes. He also established Fort Bonneville near present-day Daniel, Wyoming, sometimes referred to by contemporaries as Fort Nonsense due to its short-lived and strategic ambiguity. His work symbolized a transitional moment, exploration serving both commercial and national strategy. While South Pass would later become famous, routes like Union Pass remained essential but less widely known gateways. These high country corridors allowed movement between major drainage systems and shaped indigenous travel for centuries. Union Pass in particular connected three major river basins and functioned as a natural crossroads in the Wind River region. It reflected a broader truth. The Rocky Mountains were not a wall, but a network. American expansion would eventually follow these existing pathways, even when it believed it was discovering them anew. No discussion of this era is complete without the Lewis and Clark expedition. Commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark traveled from 1804 to 1806 to explore the Missouri River and reach the Pacific Ocean. Though their route did not pass directly through Fremont County, their expedition reshaped how Americans understood the continent. They documented geography, flora, fauna, and indigenous nations, producing one of the most important scientific and diplomatic explorations in world history. Their journey also revealed a crucial truth. The continent was not empty space awaiting discovery, but a deeply inhabited world with its own histories and nations. At the same time, entrepreneur John Jacob Astor sought to extend American commercial influence to the Pacific Northwest through the Pacific Fur Company and the establishment of Astoria in 1811. Though his efforts were disrupted by the War of 1812, Astor's vision reflected the growing belief that the American West was both an economic opportunity and a geopolitical prize. Wilson Price Hunt, employed by the Pacific Fur Company, led the first documented crossing of Union Pass, seeking a route to the Pacific Northwest. Union Pass was later named by Captain William Reynolds during the Hayden surveys of Wyoming. The name was heavy with meaning as he regarded the peak as the topographical center of the continent. Astor, Lewis and Clark, and the fur trade entrepreneurs collectively represent the early republic's expanding horizon, from political independence to continental ambition. By the 1840s, the American West was no longer only a region of fur traders and seasonal expeditions. It was becoming a place of formal exploration, mapped, measured, and interpreted by the United States government itself. At the center of that transformation stood John Charles Fremont, a young Army officer and topographical engineer whose expeditions would permanently reshape how Americans understood the Rocky Mountains. Fremont's 1842 expedition brought him directly into the Wind River country of Wyoming, a landscape already known to indigenous nations and mountain men, but largely unfamiliar to the broader American public. Traveling with experienced frontiersmen, most notably Kit Carson and Thomas Fitzpatrick, Fremont moved through river valleys, mountain passes, and high basins, collecting geographic data while also heavily relying on indigenous knowledge networks. One of his most significant achievements came in the Wind River Range, where he ascended a prominent summit later named Fremont Peak. There, he raised an American flag high above the Continental Divide, a symbolic act that reflected not only exploration, but the growing assertion of American national identity across the interior West. What made Fremont different from earlier explorers was not only what he saw, but what he published. His expedition reports, written in vivid and accessible language, were widely distributed in the eastern United States. For many Americans, his writings were their first detailed introduction to the Rocky Mountains, transforming distant wilderness into a place that could be imagined, planned for, and eventually settled. In this way, Fremont did not simply map the West, he helped define its future in the American imagination. During this same era, Wyoming sat at the intersection of three overlapping spheres of influence, what historians often describe as the meeting point of three nations in the interior West. The first was the United States, expanding westward after the Louisiana Purchase and increasingly asserting political and commercial interests in the Rocky Mountains. The second was the British sphere of influence in North America, operating primarily through the Hudson Bay Company and its extensive trade network stretching from Canada into the Northern Rockies. British traders and their indigenous allies shaped much of the northern fur trade economy, competing and cooperating with American traders in complex and shifting ways. The third was Spain, and later Mexico, whose northern frontier once extended into the broader Rocky Mountain region. While Mexican political control was strongest farther south and west, Spanish and later Mexican influence shaped early trade routes, horses, cultural exchange, and the broader geopolitics of the continent's interior. These three spheres of influence did not meet at a single marked boundary line. Instead, they overlapped across vast indigenous homelands where native nations continued to control access, movement, and diplomacy long after European empires claimed jurisdiction on maps. In places like present-day Wyoming, these influences converged in a lived landscape of trade, negotiation, and contested authority. Indigenous nations remained central actors in this system, often determining how and whether outside powers could operate within the region. Seen together, Fremont's expeditions and the overlapping influence of the United States, Britain, and Mexico reveal a critical truth about the early 19th century West. It was not a single national story unfolding in isolation, but a shared continental space shaped by multiple empires and indigenous nations at once. Wyoming, positioned near the geographic center of this dynamic world, became one of the places where those competing visions in North America intersected. And from that intersection, the modern story of the American West would begin to take shape. Between 1776 and 1812, the United States transformed from a coastal rebellion into a continental aspiration. Yet, the lands that would become Wyoming were never empty stages for this transformation. They were active landscapes shaped by indigenous nations, trade networks, and geography itself. Fremont County, South Pass, Union Pass, and the surrounding Rocky Mountain corridors remind us that history is not a straight line of expansion, but a convergence of peoples, environments, and ideas. The American Revolution declared independence, the early republic tested it, the War of 1812 defended it. And the decades that followed expanded its reach into the interior West, sometimes through cooperation, sometimes through conflict, and always through landscapes already full of meaning. One of Wyoming's greatest contributions to American democracy came in 1869. That year, the Wyoming Territory became the first government in American history to grant women the right to vote. 50 years before the 19th Amendment guaranteed women's suffrage nationally, Wyoming had already acted. Louisa Swain became one of the first women to cast a legal vote under equal suffrage laws. Esther Hobart Morris became one of the nation's first female justices of the peace, and Wyoming proudly adopted the nickname the Equality State. As the United States marks 250 years, Fremont County offers a powerful reminder that history is not confined to the past. It is embedded in place, carried forward in memory, and still unfolding in the present. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode will begin our theme for the season, the 1920s in Fremont County, and we will explore the story of the 1928 fire at St. Stephen's Mission on the Wind River Reservation. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is supported in part by funding from Wyoming Humanities and the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, visit www.windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present. Thank you.